Podcast 02, discussions of patterns, analyzing systems, worldviews, structures of thought, how this all integrates into the world, and why it's relevant. If a person were to go onto FAS.org, which is Federation of American Scientists, one would find all kinds of declassified academic papers, stuff from journals, so forth, so on. And, believe it or not, there are all kinds of actual military documents, actual what are called ethnographic studies by the Central Intelligence Agency. And what one finds is that a lot of these types of documents, papers, essays, books, are in fact written by those who have a very in-depth knowledge of philosophy, patterns and systems analysis, and worldviews. So, ironically, I discovered that there's a very clear connection between people who, for example, might have read a lot of Cornelius Van Til or Greg Bahnsen, and those who would be interested in presenting objective systems analysis, because systems work in a certain way on the basis of certain patterns to achieve certain ends and have a certain logic or structure to them. And this is true of all kinds of systems. This is true of something like an economic system, like what we might call a free market system, even though, strictly speaking, a free market is somewhat of an ideal. We have in history different nations, different groups that have enacted more or less free markets. And these markets will then evidence certain patterns, there's a certain logic inherent to them. Hegel, for example, the German philosopher, the great idealist, who, of course, I would not be advocating all of his views, but as you learn with philosophy, there are insights from all kinds of different perspectives and different philosophers. And some of the great insights from Hegel are along these lines. So Hegel would speak of a certain logic or rationality behind all these different types of systems. For example, you would find, and this is of course common to many of the German idealists, but you would find a certain spirit or logic inherent in empires, even the Persian Empire, Babylonian Empire. This is something that a thinker like Oswald Spengler keyed into. And Spengler, for example, did analysis of these cultures and of history, and himself found certain patterns and trends. Now, of course, this isn't a completely perfect science, because it involves so many different levels of reality, different interactions between all kinds of different groups. Even something like economics obviously will be involved in interactions with politics, interactions with powerful families, elites, so forth and so on. So this is not a simple, quote unquote, science like we might view arithmetic to be, or something like studying earthworms. Those are more direct and more clearly present the logic that they have than something like systems analysis and looking at the logical structure of different types of things. So what we see is that just like a computer, for example, has a certain logic to it by which it operates in order to function in the way that it's designed to, the sum of its parts all work together to achieve a desired effect. In the same way, economic systems work this way. Religious systems work this way. People groups, nations, tribes, races work this way. And even individuals' lives can be analyzed in a kind of psychoanalytical profiling or makeup. And this is why, for example, intelligence agencies will do profiling. They will do a psych profile of targets or so forth. So what we're discussing here is not something abstracted and removed from reality. It's something that's very real and very useful. So, well, how would this be useful? Who cares about philosophy? Why does this matter? Well, if you are, for example, a powerful international corporation, the success or failure of your plans and of your policies, for example, say in some indigenous region, the corporation wants to cultivate the land for some sort of rare earth minerals or something like that. Movement into that indigenous culture will, of course, involve knowledge of the practices, beliefs, modus operandi of that tribe or that indigenous people group. Because it will, as with all things in this world, be connected to some kind of operating system, right? The tribe will have some sort of belief, will be operating on some sort of presuppositions or worldview. As we discussed in the last podcast, we looked at the basics of a worldview. And philosophically speaking, that would be, as we said, ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics. But the way that this is then, again, useful is in situations where some desired effect wants to be achieved. And so for something like an international corporation where the bottom line is at stake, where objective analysis is absolutely crucial, right? The same thing might be said of something like military engagement, tactical analysis, so forth. Those kinds of analyses depend upon objectivity and things being correct. And so this is different from something like literature, literary analysis, although, however, I will make the argument that we can also find a kind of logic and structure even within something like literary analysis or literature when we look at things like archetypes, right? Jungian archetypes. We find a structure there that will in fact also be similar to structures that emerge when we do comparative religious analysis of indigenous tribes. Okay, so again, to most people, of course, this kind of stuff seems completely irrelevant. Who cares? Why does this matter? You're just spouting off whatever nonsense. To those in the know, this is actually how the world works. And again, objective analysis is absolutely crucial in the real world, in business, in military exploits, in psychological profiling, so forth, so on. Those disciplines do not admit major error, or at least they do not want it. Were one to sit in a average academic literary analysis setting, the general praxis would be something like, everything is completely up to your own interpretation. And so it would be a completely relativized setting. Whatever you feel the literature, the piece that you've read, right? Whatever you feel that it's about. Maybe you just read The Merchant of Venice, and you feel that because of your Marxist professor's analysis that it's all about money. Okay, so it's a piece about Shakespeare's proto-Marxist views. I had a professor one time who spent the entire semester trying to prove that everything in Shakespeare was proto-Marxist, which of course is complete baloney. But That was, in other words, that was more of a situation of social engineering and indoctrination than anything having to do with objective real-world analysis. So what we're talking about here is absolutely not subjective, feeling-based, emotion-based analysis here. What we're talking about here is absolutely practical, despite what most people think philosophy and analysis is. It's absolutely crucial to operating in the real world, specifically for powerful interests. If powerful interests do not have objective real-world analysis, they will fail. And in fact, when we apply this kind of patterns and systems analysis to superstructures, such as a superpower, something like the United States, Soviet Union, what we find is that when they adopt radically divergent, radically destructive, irrational views, when those views become predominant, we see systemic breakdown. Okay, so just as a computer gets a virus or has one of its central operating components or systems within the larger system break down, the computer itself will eventually break down. And you can rest assured that systems as a whole will operate the same way. If I work at a police department, the logic of the police department has a certain structure to it. If the police department largely adopts corruption, the corruption will essentially metastasize like cancer and will eat the entity as a whole. It will self-destruct. And the point of this is that, as I said in the last podcast, reason has a penultimate place, even apart from questions of in-depth theism, right? The Enlightenment thinkers placed reason in a position of exaltation, which actually was irrational. They sought to what they thought was a movement towards removing all superstition and exalting human reason, which actually backfired. And as many continental philosophical thinkers have written and aptly demonstrated, that those movements in fact backfired and became a new mythology. Of course, I would not agree with the Frankfurt School writers like Horkheimer and Adorno in terms of their overall project of Marxism. However, I do think they are correct in their sort of Nietzschean idea that the Enlightenment became its own mythos. It became its own. It became a new dogma, if you will. So what we're talking about here has nothing to do with the false debate of human reason versus religious ideology. One way that we could show this is that some religious ideologies are much more rational than others, right? So some religious beliefs are much more sensible, much more grounded in the real world than other strange beliefs. We might look at the effects, positive effects, or health benefits, so forth, that a certain religion has upon its practitioners, as opposed to the diet and health benefits of some other religion. One might be very positive, another might be very negative in their effects. And in many religious systems, diet is very closely connected to one's beliefs about the deity. So we shouldn't set reason immediately against religion per se. So, but back to patterns and structures and systems analysis. I read an interesting book on the unified field theory which pointed out that in any kind of electrical system, all the components work together to actually demonstrate, so the unified field theory holds, that there's actually a higher level of interaction between the totality of the parts that has to be there mathematically. In other words, that mathematically it's demonstrable that there is a higher level unified field, okay, to whatever mechanical instrument that's using electricity that we are seeing here. So whether it's a machine that creates widgets or whatever, it doesn't matter. For it to work, for it to have its own inherent logic, there's a higher level, higher dimension of reality that's assumed or presupposed. That's actually there. Okay, so we're not saying that this is something that's merely mental. No, it's in the working of that thing. There is a higher level reality interacting that not only is mathematically demonstrable, but also has certain physical electromagnetic effects that can be seen as well. So that's an example, an analogy of what goes on in religious systems, or in an individual's belief system, or in economic systems, governmental systems, so forth and so on. And what, of course, is truly fascinating about all this is there has to, for any of this analysis to be done across, right, different systems, there has to be some kind of prior, presupposed logic, okay, inherent in the work of analyzing cross systems. Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, for an analyst, for a person who's doing this kind of analysis, in the very operation of analyzing something like an economic system on one hand, and then turning around and analyzing something like electromagnetism on the other hand, and then turning around and analyzing something like a religious system, okay, there's inherent in this process itself, which is not purely mental, okay, so we're not saying idealism or anything like that. Inherent in that is some sort of prior logic, reason, logoi, whatever we want to talk about here, a meaning, a structure, okay, a substructure to the process of analysis itself. And I argue that the very fact that this goes on and works and presents patterns is proof itself that there is this substructure. And so this is a kind of transcendental argument from patterns and systems analysis. I'm not, of course, arguing that Kant was right in proposing transcendental idealism. I do not believe that that is the correct view. However, why? Well, because there are all kinds of problems by which that system breaks down at a fundamental level. However, there are clear indicators that what he's doing with a transcendental argument, which actually goes back to Aristotle, Kant is not the first person to propose a transcendental argument, that this actually works. This actually makes sense. This is actually what's going on. Because we can never prove from sense experience something or something universal or the totality of something, right, merely from sense experience. This is where all the empiricists are wrong, because the empiricists always all wanted to say that all of our reality is purely based on sense experience. Well, of course, that's not true, and we can show that it's not true by simply elucidating the very foundational point in that system. Where does it start? Okay, so we're doing a systems analysis of empiricism, and its foundational starting point is that all knowledge comes through sense experience. Well, just like we did with relativism yesterday, when we analyze the claim that all knowledge comes through sense experience, we find that that claim itself is not something that comes through sense experience. Okay, so this, if you know a little bit about mathematics, which I don't claim to be, or am not some sort of expert in mathematics, but in mathematic theory, this is analogous to Kurt Gödel. Gödel's theorem is very similar in that it analyzes mathematical set theory, and shows that you can never, within a given mathematical set, prove the foundational axioms of that set. So, in other words, foundational claims within systems, like Gödel's claim, are themselves self-referential. This is the crucial point in the Gödel-Escher-Bach book, the Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Douglas Hofstadter. This is where it starts. It starts by pointing this out, that we find this circular structure in Bach, in the Risser-Car, in Gödel's theorem, and in the mathematical structure of M.C. Escher's drawings. So that's a great illustration of the point I'm making here with systems analysis. Systems analysis involves looking at systems, and we can, of course, classify any of these examples that I've given as a system. We can even classify things like a video game, right? Because a video game is working on a certain set of algorithms by which the AI characters within the game will be working. It gets really complex, of course, when you have humans interacting in the game, and so then it becomes a really difficult mathematical game theory situation based on contingencies and so forth. But for the purposes of basics of systems analysis, no, we don't have to exclude even something like video games. We can say we can look at the similarities there as well. It's going to have a certain logic to it, in other words. So, patterns and systems analysis begins then with, or should begin with, what are the foundational presuppositions, the axioms, the starting points for this system. And all human systems will work this way because they will work as a web of beliefs, if you will, as the transcendental philosophers speak of it. There would be a web of beliefs centered around a central point, or there could be more than one central point. There could be 2, 3, more than one foundational axioms that hold together a system, and by which the removal of any of these could then topple the entire system. So, for example, if one wanted to bring down some religious group, if one wanted to topple them for, say, espionage or for, say, apologetic purposes, one would locate the foundational presuppositions of that system. And by knocking out one of those foundational axioms in the psyche of key members of that group, it would only be a matter of time before the system as a whole would experience systemic breakdown. So we begin to see then how this is all very relevant to the real world, and not just armchair blabbering and philosophizing. It's crucially relevant. If one wanted to, for example, remove persons from belief in a Thomistic worldview based on the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, one would go to the foundational propositions of Thomism, deconstruct them, and show them to be false or incoherent. This would then lead the leaders of Thomism, again, assuming that you were successful in convincing them that it was wrong, the leaders would then have a period of time whereby they experienced the breakdown in their own mind of Thomism, which would then filter down to the rest of the persons within the church or that scheme or whatever. That's just an example. And so the same thing could be affected or done in other systems and other schemes. This could be very dangerous, and so I don't usually talk about this kind of stuff. I've been accused a lot of being some sort of manipulator of this kind, where I found it simply enjoyable to play with systems and something like that. That's not actually the case, but my actual motives in these kinds of things were always with the intention of actually aiming towards the totality scheme of systems and the rationality of systems analysis itself. So it was never about merely playing some sort of mind game or something like that. It's what we're talking about here is much more than much heavier, much weightier than some sort of mere mind game. So we notice that systems have these patterns. We notice that we give an example here of the foundational axiom or the presuppositional belief, and we've noticed then that other less foundational propositions or beliefs will then be founded on and placed in the schema or the web, whatever analogy you want to use, and are held there based on the belief in the foundational view, right? So if we were to examine something, again, let's use Thomism. If we were to say Thomism begins with its foundational axioms of, say, something like natural theology or belief in the oneness of God, and that this is philosophically demonstrable by natural philosophy. These are foundational propositions or beliefs within Thomism upon which all Thomists then work. They build up from there. Were we to demonstrate this to be incorrect, we would see the higher order or less central beliefs of Thomism. For example, something like Thomas's view of, say angels, right? Thomas's view of angels as beings existing as intellectual realities that are not part of the, generally speaking, part of the material plane, material world. The belief in angels that Aquinas has is not as central as foundational as the belief that he has about angels. About natural theology, aseity, and the oneness of God. Okay, the absolute divine simplicity, as Aquinas famously holds to. So that would be much more foundational, and deconstructing the foundational assumptions of the aseity and the absolute divine simplicity would then have a much more systemic effect than disproving, say, if one were able to do this somehow, some sort of argument that disproved Aquinas' view of angels, or however many angels could dance on the head of a pin. The view of oneness or aseity is much more central, much more foundational. It's one of the starting points. And so once we realize that there's an inherent logic to beliefs, to systems, to these patterns have a certain logic to them, it becomes very evident that then knocking out aspects of the system are then what's beneficial for different groups for different reasons. And again, I was just using that as an example. I suppose an international corporation could have a use for knocking out Thomism, but the Anti-Thomist Corporation Incorporated has been seeking and conspiring for years to destroy Thomism. So, and in that example, I'm not at all saying that everything in Thomism is false, or that I think that Thomism needs to be destroyed per se. I think there are a lot of flaws in that system, but that's a different question from what we're doing here. We're looking at the logic and rationality of systems analysis. Is there a logic and rationality to systems analysis? I think so. So we've looked at the web of beliefs, we've looked at the foundational propositions by which everything else in that web is strung, or upon which everything else is built. We note then the psychological effects of members of the group when the foundational beliefs are knocked out, or are challenged, or questioned successfully. And so this is, of course, where areas like psychology and propaganda and psychological warfare are relevant. Psychological warfare, for example, would be very much interested in what I'm discussing. This is precisely why the CIA presents ethnographic analyses. In order to have an effect upon said group, one would have to understand the logic of that group. Even if the group is highly illogical, it still benefits one to understand the illogic upon which that group is working. So what we're discussing here is a little bit more pragmatic in its effect, even though I, as my own personal interest, I'm interested in the logic behind logic, the meta-logic, the meta systems analysis, if you will, for the purposes of employment, or for the purposes of different groups or corporations or whatever entities. Their interests are more pragmatic. So these subjects are then, of course, used pragmatically speaking by those groups who don't have necessarily personal interests in obtaining the real truth of the matter. However, aside from the obtaining the grand truth of the matter, there is, of course, dire necessity in determining the more localized truth of the matter, the more objective truth of the matter for said purposes of whatever group, whatever their intentions may be. So this is all very real world. This is all very relevant. None of this is something that should be considered, purely theoretical. That's what I think is the most frustrating aspect of someone who studied philosophy, is that apart from a very small group of people, other fellow eccentrics who are into this kind of stuff, it's a very small group who actually find this interesting. And so the rest of the world, of course, just sees philosophy as something completely irrelevant, something completely, armchair. It's just sitting around and spouting off at the mouth. Well, none of which could be further from the truth. So we've talked about then the purpose of why this is relevant, why this is used, why this is an example. In the last podcast I mentioned that philosophy does matter. Well, here's an example, a real world example of how philosophy matters. And you probably haven't ever thought of that. Most people haven't. So here now I've given you a great secret here about how the world really works. Because those who obsess over studying how the world really works come to learn and find out that what's really going on, how the world is really being run and operated, is very different from the popular explanations and understandings of the world. Unfortunately, in our era, we are very much dominated by a purely pragmatic British utilitarian might makes right type of, we live in that type of a world. And this is something that's a result of a lot of factors like Darwinism and things like that. So we have largely tossed aside our more theoretical commitments because of empiricism and utilitarianism and materialism, which have come to dominate the West, and which have then led to these systems. Have central flaws which lead to systemic breakdown. And so the adoption of these kinds of philosophies working together in their own kind of blended system in the West, which has produced a purely pragmatic might makes right view of how the West should operate. This is, of course, the central reason for the West's systemic breakdown. Not, of course, faulting the British Empire per se, because there is a logic to this kind of pragmatism. It's not all wrong. For example, part of what I've been arguing here is that systems analysis itself is relevant because of the fact that it is pragmatic. Okay, it does have an immediate real-world application. However, the downside is that the movement towards being merely pragmatic can divorce one from the higher dimensions, from the higher reality, from universals, from the form, which are ultimately, I believe, emanations from God. And so the turn towards the purely material as an end in itself and as a mean in itself, and exalting human reason as something that somehow is the final penultimate summit of our system, there are dire consequences for doing that. And so we end up with a meaningless, nihilistic self-destruction from that perspective. So, in other words, applying the systems analysis that I've been talking about to the West itself right now, this is the kind of problems that we would point out. We would say the West has achieved this sort of imperial status. And again, I'm not making a moral criticism of empire. Empire could be good. It could work. There's nothing inherently wrong with empire per se. But the problems with empire, as we see from history, and which occur over and over and over, and I think Spangler is very insightful on this, is that empire has achieved a certain level of rationality to where the means become an end in themselves, right? So that there's no ideology, because to achieve empire, pragmatism has been adopted so heavily. In other words, to increase power, right? Deception has been used so often that the logic of the empire itself becomes sort of lost in the lies that it has constructed to get to where it is. And I'm not even saying that deception and the use of such things in psychological warfare is always wrong. I'm not saying that. That would be unrealistic and silly. There's nothing wrong with that by itself, but there's a danger in an empire adopting a might makes right philosophy, because it will lead to its own destruction. That's the point. Just as we said earlier in the beginning of the podcast, a fundamental, foundational error adopted will eventually lead to a systemic collapse. So, really smart people know this, and they have used this, for example, to wage philosophical warfare or cultural warfare. So, if you study espionage or if you study geopolitics, you will discover that, for example, Khrushchev had the famous statement where he banged his shoe at the UN and said, "We will destroy the West. We will infiltrate the West. We will destroy it by philosophical means, which include all of these sort of practical means economic attack, philosophical attack, cultural attack, so forth, so on." And the adoption of relativism. Yesterday's discussion on relativism. The adoption of relativism, it can be used then, you see, as a systemic attack on the foundational presuppositions and beliefs of the West. You see, the West, from the time of Aristotle and Plato on, and along with Moses, the West did not believe in relativism. Relativism was the philosophy of the sophists, and Aristotle and Plato both, in rejecting relativism, argued with the sophists. However, when relativism becomes dominant, as we see now, it very closely, you can trace the systemic destruction and collapse that is attendant upon it. And although the listener may not be aware of this, smart people who know philosophy and who study psychological warfare and things like that do know this. They do know that one can attack with philosophy that then leads to social decay and destruction. And for the persons who love to come and click dislike on everything that I post, whoever that is, or they are, this is really obvious. I mean, I'm sorry that, if this makes you mad, I don't know what to say, but this is the case, right? So whether you accept this or not is true. And there's not really much debate that can be had on this topic for anyone who knows of this topic, right? And I don't claim to be an expert on this, but I am interested in it. This is the subject matter that I spend a lot of time reading, writing, and contemplating about, because it is so practical. Just because your immediate social circles and family members don't know anything about this or talk, it doesn't mean that it's not practical. Just because you haven't heard of this doesn't mean that none of this is relevant. So there's, of course, much prejudice against the quote philosopher. I recently went to a debate in Washington, D.C., and one of the proponents in the debate laughed at me when I said that I was a philosopher. Of course, not that I was saying it somewhat tongue-in-cheek. I didn't actually mean it in a pretentious, haughty way. But of course, he laughed at me, and this individual, of course, works with intelligence agencies that know good and well that philosophy is used in such things as ethnographic analysis. So, whatever. I'm constantly assumed to be stupider than I am, which I think is funny. So I enjoy it. I enjoy being treated like I'm an idiot. But that's fine. We can just get on this podcast and then completely deconstruct everything you're saying. So, I would advise the listeners to review what I'm saying here. I know I'm right about this because I have actually downloaded entire papers and theses from FAS.org, and they all deal with the very things that you're hearing about here. Now, I did this kind of stuff pretty recently, branching out into studying espionage, because I didn't actually know any of this. I didn't know that 5 or 6 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, when I started studying philosophy. Well, actually 10 years ago, starting studying philosophy. But I didn't actually know that geopolitics was very much concerned with and interconnected with the questions of philosophy and worldviews. So this is going to be very relevant to cultured, wise listeners and individuals. And this is a whole branch of study. This is a whole field of research and study. So that's enough for now. Stay tuned. We'll continue to. This is a little bit more advanced than the last podcast, which was an introduction. But I was in the mood to do something a little more advanced. We can move on from here. We can talk more about systems analysis, relevance, examples of it. We can do an example of it. We can look at different papers produced by the Central Intelligence Agency, analyze those papers, see how they're doing it, because they're essentially just doing a kind of apologetics, right? I mean, that's really what propaganda is. We should also in this podcast look at things like Kant, look at individual philosophers, analyze their argumentation, pull out the insights and the errors. I mentioned Hume in the last one, and certainly the crucial insights and flaws of both Kant and Hume should be analyzed. So maybe that's what we'll do next time. We'll just have to see what my mood is. Thanks for listening.